Perfect. Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our session on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aislynn Rowe. I am Digna Program Manager based at Cooperation Canada. So today we'll be using simultaneous interpretation thanks to the sessions to forum sponsor Children Believe. You will be able to listen to interpretation from French to English or English to French. If you'd like to use this, please go to the bottom of your Zoom window. You'll see an interpretation icon. It looks like a little globe. If you're not seeing the icon, make sure you've downloaded the latest Zoom update. And unfortunately, it won't work if you're using the browser instead of the app. Once you've found that icon, you can click on it and select the language you'd like to hear. Once you've selected the language, you should be able to see an arrow with the language that you've chosen. And you will probably want to select mute original audio so you're not listening to interpretation on top of what we are saying. Donc, on va maintenant vérifier si tout le monde comprend si je parle en français. Et pour les francophones, on a de l'interprétation simultanée grâce à Children Believe aujourd'hui. Donc, vous pouvez choisir la langue que vous voulez écouter. C'est juste en bas de votre écran sur Zoom. Cliquez sur l'icône et vous pouvez choisir d'écouter en français. Et vous pouvez aussi choisir de couper l'audio original pour que tu entends seulement l'interprétation. So now that you should all be able to hear us in the language of your choice, let's get started. And before I get started, I wish to recognize that I'm joining you personally from the city of Ottawa, located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat peoples. In an entirely virtual event, I know that many of you are participating from many parts of Canada and perhaps the world, so I encourage you, if you don't already know, to do some research on the original peoples for where you are located. And if you do already know, I invite you to introduce yourself and where you're joining us from in the chat. This land recognition serves to both remind us of the contributions of those who came before us and of the importance of working daily on reconciliation. We wish to also specifically recognize that June is Indigenous History Month, and this year, National Indigenous History Month is dedicated to the missing children, the families left behind, and the survivors of residential schools. So if you belong to me if you belong like me to the settler peoples who benefit from the privileges of a country built on colonialism, I hope this land acknowledgement can serve both as a moment of respect to our Indigenous peoples whose land we live and work on, as well as a moment of reflective discomfort. We're about to have a conversation about the legal concepts that surround the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. And we can take this moment to recognize that among other things, Canada has an appalling record of sexual exploitation and abuse towards Indigenous peoples, and also the ways that the legal system in Canada still fails to support the protection needs and the justice that is sought by many survivors. So as Digna and as a sector, we're hoping that we all commit at home and globally to do better. And so today's session will talk about the guidance developed by Digna's Lawyers Working Group on basic legal concepts that organizations should know related to their duty of care related to prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse, PSEA. And we'll be exploring how organizations can work together to uphold their obligations and recognize the power imbalances that perpetuate sexual exploitation and abuse. We will be doing an interactive session today, so I hope you're ready to participate. We'll be using Mentimeter. Most of you should be familiar with it by now. And we've also scheduled a Q&A session for the end of the content. And at that time, we'll ask that you ask questions to the Lawyers Working Group by typing them into the Mentimeter. You can, in the meantime, use the chat function in Zoom for your technical issues if you can't hear us or need us to slow down or anything like that. And when we do open the Q&A, we ask that your questions remain related to the work of the working group and the content of the guide, which we will share with you momentarily. As the lawyers here today can't provide legal advice about specific scenarios in your organization, and we wish that you don't put them in that awkward situation. So I will now allow the members of the lawyers working group to introduce themselves, starting with Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Aislynn. My name is Sarah Mehboob, and I am speaking to you today from the region of Peel, which is part of the treaty lands and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And like Aislynn explained, during the past few months, I had the wonderful opportunity to work with the team of lawyers today on this call with us in preparing this guide that we're presenting to you today. I will take the next few minutes to give you a brief background to this memorandum or guide, which we have collectively prepared before my other colleagues talk more about the memorandum and other relevant issue. And we would be happy to take your questions towards the end of the session. Before we embark on a discussion on this guide, I wanted to begin by clarifying that the information contained in this guide is based on the information available to us at the time of writing. This guide is intended to provide the information that informs our work. It does not aim to inform any specific case or incident. So therefore, as Aislynn said, this memo does not provide any legal advice. Also, before I begin talking about the guide itself, I wanted to begin by reinforcing something that I'm sure we all are aware of, that all Canadian organizations must commit to preventing and responding to sexual exploitation and abuse in the delivery of international assistance. This abuse of power and trust violates human rights and undermines our collective efforts to address gender inequalities. There should be zero tolerance for individuals who abuse their position to sexually exploit or abuse the very people that they are there to help. Therefore, everyone working in the international assistance sphere has the responsibility to step up and address these issues. I would now like to take a minute to give you some background on why we embarked on this project and the reasons for taking up and collecting this information and putting it in this form of a guide for you and for other readers. One of the reasons was that we're aware that while many organizations acknowledge their duty of care, both legal and moral, to provide safe workplaces, yet what it means in practice seems to be unclear. And this memorandum aims to address some of those ambiguities and some of those questions. This memo also aims to provide some context to demystify the legal language. We all know the legal process can be complicated, legal terminology can be confusing, and one of our aims in putting together this guide was to demystify that language and to empower a common sense approach to the prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse. So you do not necessarily need to be very well versed with legal terminology alone, in our opinion, to be able to prevent sexual exploitation. We want to empower the organizations to take a common sense approach in prevention of any exploitation, harassment, and abuse within their organization. In this regard, one of the key components that we want everyone to consider is the power inherent in organizations, the mindfulness about this power, and the organization's own initiative to do the right thing in the face of an abuse or misuse of power. This memorandum was prepared also to further help organizations understand their role in prevention of this abuse and exploitation. So basically, once you understand your role, once you understand the dynamics of power, you are then able to balance that power between program participants and program managers. The hope is that this will initiate meaningful conversations within the organizations about the ways in which organizations can improve the ways in which they work to prevent harm and exploitation. We also hope that this document will assist with the recognition of how organizations' policies and procedures can work to prevent sexual exploitation. And eventually, the hope is that the document will empower the organization's staff to speak up within their structures, for the organizations to develop better policies and procedures so that there are proper checks and balances put in place to address the power inherent in organizational decision-making. I would now like to take a couple of minutes to talk about the content. I will not be able to cover the entire document per se, but we will have an opportunity to have conversations about the main themes. But to give you briefly an overview, the memo focuses on the concept of duty of care, a concept which we believe all organizations need to be mindful of in their work. We understand that there can be confusions and ambiguities about what this concept entails. So we break down this concept of duty of care to help the reader better understand what this means. Briefly, the duty of care in the context of international humanitarian cooperation and assistance work can perhaps be best framed as the organization's obligation to manage and address foreseeable risks, which will, of course, in many cases, will be context specific. Flowing from this is the additional question, which we also take up in the guide, is who is owed this duty of care? We flag in the guide that the scope of this duty can be pretty broad. International development and humanitarian sector organizations have a duty of care towards their program participants, employees, interns, and volunteers. So the scope is pretty broad. The memo also includes a discussion on mitigation strategies, which we hope the organizations have already put in place. And if not, we'll take this opportunity today to think it through and probably have it on agenda to be put in place so that there is no abuse, exploitation, and harassment within their organization. And not just for organizations, we believe that the information provided in this guide would be helpful for anyone working in this field or anyone who wants to understand more these concepts. To continue the discussion, I will now pass on to my colleagues, and of course I'm around and will be happy to chat more about anything that concerns, anything that you want to discuss more. Thank you. I will now pass it to Shauna and Erica.
Thank you, Sarah. My name is Shauna Gibbons, and I'm a lawyer in good standing in the Alberta Law Society. And I work in a private firm called Main Street Law. I'm meeting with you from Treaty 6 land of the Cree, Ojibwa, and Assiniboine nations, as well as the Métis people.
And hello, everyone. My name is Erica C., and I'm a lawyer in good standing with the Law Society of Ontario. I'm joining you from the city of Ottawa, which is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat people.
And Erica and I are here to provide legal information in support of Digna and your efforts to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse in providing Canadian aid internationally. We will not be able to provide you with a legal opinion. Can you tell that we really want you to understand we can't give you legal advice on a specific issue, but we're here to give you some general information that we hope will help your organizations in the future.
So the good news is that you don't necessarily need a law degree to know what to do. Everything that you'll see in the guide, as much as it is couched in legal frameworks, is really good common sense. It is principles, it is policies, it is processes that are core to and should be very familiar to well-run professional organizations like yours. And though that same principle, that common sense approach of protection for your humanitarian work is what we're talking about when we talk about processes and policies that will protect those you serve against sexual abuse and exploitation. So Sarah gave you a great general overview of the guide that's been prepared for you. And now we want to turn to help you understand how your organization can benefit from using this guide, and then provide you with some opportunities for practical application through a couple case studies. And that's where your participation comes in. Our goal as the Lawyers Working Group is to provide you with information that you can use, ironically, to avoid needing lawyers like us in the future. In our respective practice areas, our job as lawyers is to point out potential risks, provide viable options, and provide appropriate recommendations, and allow the client to make an informed choice on preventing harm or redressing harm that has already occurred. We know that sexual harassment, exploitation, and abuse causes harm to the victims as well as the communities in which those victims live, sometimes for generations. So we all know that this is an important issue, and preventing that harm is our paramount objective, as we are sure it is yours as well. But how exactly do you do that? Shauna, over to you.
So in our view, there are some key measures that your organizations can take, and we hope this guide will assist you in taking those. Preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, in our view, requires, first, a clear understanding of your organization's points of biggest risk. 2, a clear plan to mitigate those risks. 3, clear implementation strategies of your organization's policies. And 4, clear avenues of reporting and investigation should harm occur. Our time today is limited, so we will focus on the first 3 objectives, and we'll repeat them, and you'll see some of them on the screen as well. So if you're madly taking notes and can't listen, it's more important for you to listen. So the first 3 objectives: understanding points of risk, mitigation plan, and implementation strategies. In a subsequent document and workshop, we will provide some guidance steps necessary once the harm is alleged or has occurred and an investigation is necessary. So that's for a later date. For right now, we're going to begin with understanding points of risk. So in our view, before you even start using this guide and flip to page 1, we strongly suggest that you look at the structure of your own organization and pay attention to where power and decision-making occurs within your organization. Are there clear lines of accountability in every aspect of your organization? Are there decisions that are made at the point of contact with program participants that are made by only one person? Are there decisions about staffing, voluntary or paid, that are made by only one person? Do you have a clear feedback mechanism in your organization, and how is that feedback received and used? Do you have regular check-ins with the risk points in your organization? In our view, these questions are also a starting point for a risk audit, which is a helpful way for your organization to conduct your organization's work and policy on a regular basis. A regular pattern of assessment and feedback can be helpful in normalizing and reflecting on power and how it's used in your organization, as well as preventing misuse or abuse of power. These are mitigation plans and implementation strategies once you understand where specifically are the points of risk inherent in your specific organization. So Erica is going to talk a little bit more about mitigation plans.
Hi again. So yes, the mitigation plan. So in other words, how you address each of those points of risk that Shauna just talked about. And again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to really look carefully at your organization's unique structure, its service delivery model, and other perhaps strategy, mitigations that might already be in place for other methods, for example, financial mitigations. So when we talk about mitigations, we're of course talking about lessening that risk level. We know that operating always involves some level of risk. It's very difficult to go to absolute zero. But when we talk about mitigation, we're talking about practical measures, activities, strategies, processes, policies that can help reduce that risk significantly. So that's why a mitigation plan is the next logical step for addressing these points of risk that you've identified. The guide that we've developed can help you think through mitigations for each of your identified risks. But again, each organization is unique, and we encourage you to tailor your mitigations to your organizations. Use your own terminology, your own way of approaching your service delivery model. Our assumption, and certainly our hope, is that most, if not all, organizations here today already have developed some policy or a code of conduct to outline behavioral expectations within the organization. If you haven't yet, please use this as your opportunity to do so from both a legal and, of course, a moral perspective. If you have already developed policies to prevent sexual abuse and exploitation, this guide can help you evaluate and update your policies. Because of course, policies and processes are live documents. It's very important to look at them regularly, to refresh them for the evolving needs of your organization. Make sure, for example, that your phrasing used, it reflects your current organization, that the phrasing is easy to understand, not legalese, and that every staff member knows how to find them. Start by asking key questions like, do you have a clear definition for sexual abuse and exploitation in your policy and procedural documents? Do people know what that word means? Do your policies clearly outline the duty of care that we mentioned for each job and role in your organization? Does your code of conduct include expectations for behavior? And it includes both paid and unpaid employees, as well as donors and other third parties, such as contractors. Do you have policy and procedure documents that clearly state a person's duty to escalate concerns if they arise, and to whom and how to escalate those concerns? I think this is a very important one. And in terms of best practice, it's always a good idea to have more than one option for escalating concerns so that the person with the concerns can choose the route that they're most comfortable with. Keep in mind that policies and procedures, as I mentioned, are living documents. So having one policy written 10 years ago and left in a dusty, forgotten corner is not helping your organization, and it's not helping anybody your organization serves. In terms of the guide itself, we encourage you to look through section 7 of the guide, which provides some clear detail that can assist your organization's executive, board, HR, or other key leaders to assess and regularly update your ongoing policies to ensure they are current with Canadian law and policy development. Now let's talk about some implementation strategies.
Yeah, and we'd like to give you some time to really engage in some questions and engage in this guide. So really quickly, there's the third loop. So you've identified risk, you've mitigated that risk. Now there's also the ongoing work, the implementation of those policies. Policies are only as good as you implement and work on them. So this might be referred to in your organization as procedures, or it may simply be the way the work is done. Training and accountability of volunteer and paid employees are key aspects of to implement a mitigation strategy or to implement your policies. Some key questions: does your initial training at the point of entry for your volunteer or employees include clear reference to your plan to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse, including how to raise concerns effectively within the organization and to whom? Do you have regular ongoing training? And does your organization maintain regular accountability and job review discussions with volunteer and paid employees? And are you capable of doing field site reviews? Can you actually see the program participants and the delivery of aid firsthand as an oversight? So before we get into case studies, we'll just wrap up this deep dive into our guide, and I'll turn it back to Erica.
So just before we, as Shauna said, we go to case studies, we just wanted to mention, in addition to the options available to complain or raise concerns as they arise, feedback mechanisms are a great way to allow members within your organization to alert you to current and potential issues, risks, gaps in your mitigation plan. We know as human beings that it's often very difficult to complain or raise a concern, especially if you're new in an organization. So again, these feedback mechanisms are a great strategy as well to allow people to raise concerns in ways they feel comfortable with. Without clear communication, including a feedback loop from all levels of your organization, even the best mitigation plans can fail to be implemented, as Shauna mentioned. And if the mitigation plan fails because it's not fully or appropriately implemented, and as our guide details, your legal liability as an organization increases, and as well as, of course, the risk of harm. We can all agree that eliminating sexual exploitation and abuse is a harm that we want to avoid. So let's now turn to some practical applications of preventing sexual abuse and exploitation through a few case studies. Over to our colleagues, Marie-Audrey and Sarah.
Sure, thank you, Erica and Shauna. Marie and I would be, discussing the case studies with you in the next few minutes. But before we get into the actual case studies, I wanted to take a minute to let you know that I want you to take your time to think through the information that my colleagues Erica and Shauna provided, and give yourself the time to put your thought process where if you need some time to think through these issues, because we understand that it takes time to think through the various layers of organizational structures that we all work within. So while you think about these case studies, I want you to think about any situations that you might have encountered, or if not, something that you think can inform our discussion today. So we would really appreciate your input today. The idea is really to have an open conversation, and we all are always learning. So don't feel shy to bring up a question or a comment. So I'm gonna now read out the first case study, and then we'll take it forward from there. So you can also see it up on your screens, but I'm just going to also quickly read it out for you. It says, your organization has an anonymous confidential suggestion box one day you receive an unsigned handwritten note in the box. The note says, "This organization is not a safe place for women to come for help. I have witnessed how some of the male staff treat women, and it is unacceptable. Something should be done about this." So we will have some pointers on the screen, and you see the first one there. But like I said before, take your time and think through the case study and the question, which is up on the screen, and also try to think about some of the points that Erica and Shauna brought up. I see a lot of you participating already, so that's great.
If I may, for people who don't know what to do, could you please go to menti.com and use the code 59263637, and you'll be able to participate with everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to give a couple of seconds for those of us who are still figuring out how to use the Mentimeter. Interesting. So, and feel free to continue to give your feedback, and I will continue to incorporate that. But I'm just going to read out the first question. In the meantime, the question was, has your organization received an anonymous statement like this one, asking for some action without any reference points? And as you can see on your screen, a lot of people are not sure, while there are a few who say that they have seen such an anonymous statement. A lot of I'm not sure, people are still giving in their feedback, which we're very grateful for. So it seems to have stopped now. So I think I'm gonna stop there, but we can always come back to it and discuss this if you want to going forward. So the second question we had was, do you have to respond in such a situation? And I see a graph. I think this is going by how people are voting. And a lot of people think that they have to respond. And also a couple who are not sure, which is understandable. It was an anonymous statement, as you remember, but had something which was of concern. So it seemed to have stopped at this point. So I think I'm going to stop now. So we have about 22 people say that we should respond, and about 6 who are not sure, and 2 who think there is no obligation to respond. So I think I'm going to move on to the next one now. Okay, so those were the two questions, and so the idea behind this case study at this point was to get you thinking about these issues, and of course towards the end we will have a Q&A, so we can take up your questions and concerns at that time. I'm going to now pass it on to my colleague Marie to take up the next case study with you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Marie Audrey. I'm joining you from Edmonton, which is a Treaty 6 territory, as Shauna introduced it earlier. I will present the second case study that we have today, and you will see it's we will have like more open-ended questions for this case study. So let me read it to you first, and then we can dig into the questions that we have for you. So your organization has a stellar longtime employee who is beloved in the community. They refer to him as Uncle Joe. Uncle Joe was in the organization before the code of conduct was in place and has been avoiding signing or attending online trainings, citing internet issues and forgetfulness. Your organization have hired a human resources firm to help you mitigate risk of abuse and exploitation, and they recommend that Uncle Joe be terminated by a certain date if he doesn't comply with the policy. You have informed Uncle Joe he has 6 weeks to comply, and the community has sent you letters asking you to make an exception for him because they love him too much to see him go. So this is a case study, and we have some questions, open-ended questions for you. So in this scenario, what are the red flags in this scenario, in your opinion? And if you think there are any red flags. If I'm not mistaken, I think you can answer in the chat. Is that right? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, we have a lot of good answers. Yeah, like I think like many of the answers points toward the, well, the refusal in itself to sign, to have training. Why would he doesn't want to sign or have training on those questions? Yes, and of course, I think there's a good point. I think at the end, if we can scroll down, like trying to force training through online methods when they should be tailored to suit different people in different communities. I think that's a really good point. How to make sure that like the information is accessible to everybody. And how to make sure like that the information, like we have been talking about legal information this morning, and how to make sure that everybody is aware of their obligation in a way that everybody can understand. So yes, so I think like there's lots of good points here, and I'm trying to see all the answers here. Yes, and I think that's what we wanted to point out in with this first questions. The second question is, what are the potential options for Uncle Joe, for your organization, for the community? Yes, I think it's really important for organization to talk with I think Jim has a question regarding that. How can we share the organization expectation when it comes to prevention of sexual abuse? So I think it's really important to have this conversation with third party organization too, and like to have really clear guideline for everybody that take part in the programs, trying to see any other maybe answers that we have.
Yeah, Marie, just to help you out with reading that, I do see a very important flag of asking him to sign up for training, which I think is very important. No matter how long the employee has been with an organization, training is important. And I noticed that that was brought up by one of the participants.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one to see. Yeah, and I think there are many participants pointing out like the importance of having some vocabulary that everybody can understand. And as my colleagues pointed out earlier, I think like we're talking about legal obligation this morning, but I think it's really important for everybody to have a common understanding of those obligations and to have like this common sense approach when it comes to discussing those legal obligations, because sometimes legal jargon can be complicated, but I think like those obligations are easy to translate to like all the members and all the participants.
Can I jump in, Maria?
Yeah, of course, Shauna, please.
So the other thing that we're hoping to give you with this guide is your own third party way to bring up these kinds of conversations. So you can use this guide as those sticky lawyers in Canada have created this thing, and the lawyers are telling us. So sometimes that can start a conversation with that takes away the emotion and the dynamic between the organization and the third party or the employee volunteer by making it those big bad lawyers in their big bad guide. So that's another way that you can use this tool.
Okay, I think we had really good answers. Maybe I will jump to the last one. What procedures are in place in your organization to address this issue in a timely way? Just leave some time for people to answer. I see two answers. Focal points with responsibility for PSEA, none, code of conduct sign off regularly. I think this is definitely really important. Require annual renewal acceptance of all policies on an annual basis. No, that's exactly not just to do it once and then be done with it and then it goes on a shelf. I think those principles are really important. And I think every year it should like have like this kind of signature of a new well of a code of conduct, and like it should be an ongoing discussion, not just once for all discussion. And then I see we have policy and a complaints mechanism and a clear person responsible to manage the complete and process for handling it and then doing follow-up, including discipline. So like to have like a person in charge of this, yeah, that's good too. I see maybe Erica, you want to jump in?
Oh, no, I see it there. Training and refresher training is important too. So I think that is an excellent and important suggestion as well, because of course I definitely think that annual sign off is important, but that the most important is the substantive understanding. So things like training, things like supervisor conversations that are then documented, those are great strategies. So, those processes, it's great to have standard processes. And I love the person who said that you could, track compliance with the spreadsheet. That's a wonderful idea. But, just to reiterate something we said earlier, that this is a common sense approach. So definitely those HR processes that you already use in your organization to ensure good performance, that can also encompass a practical, rooted in your organization reality understanding of sexual abuse and exploitation prevention policies and procedures.
Yeah, and I think like we have like other answers that are having a little bit the same information. So I think that those were the questions we wanted to ask regarding this case study. And I think right now we can maybe open the floor for questions. Like if you have any questions regarding those case studies or like more generally, we can try to have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you to the members of the working group, of the lawyers working group. So as Mary Audrey said, this is the time to ask your questions. You can do that by typing your question on the chat, or you can raise your hand if you would like to talk. Okay, I have a question from Jim Cornelius. Go ahead, Jim.
big thing that we wrestle with is that we do not directly engage with program participants. All this is done by third parties. And I find it a bit, and basically most of the legal advice we get, or most of the advice simply says, well, you got to put requirements into your contracts with third parties. But we know that doesn't actually get us very far in terms of actually dealing with some of the issues. Just putting stuff into contracts. So I don't know what the legal advice is on how to manage this relationship with third parties who are the ones, these are our partners on the ground. They are the ones engaging directly with program participants. And most of the advice we get relates to activities we would have direct control over. Very little of the advice relates to how we manage when we're working through third parties. So I'd be interested in your legal take on that.
I could share a few thoughts unless anybody else wants to jump in. So yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and of course we can't provide you legal advice, but just sort of more broadly from a approach perspective, I think the practical strategies, the practical question you have is a very valid one. So leaving aside the contract pieces that you already mentioned, I guess, and this sort of flows on from what I was saying earlier, I would reflect back to you in terms of those on the ground partners. How do you ensure they're doing their job anyway? What do you do to validate, to audit, to check in on program implementation, and use those same techniques for these, more difficult conversation? Put in I don't know if you maybe have an interim report or something like that. You can put in a question that pertains to these strategies that we talked about in the guide, and put that to them. So make it part of the core expectation for the third parties, just as you would yourself. So that's and check in, make it part of the dialogue. Again, we recognize that we're coming out of a period where these issues weren't talked about, so we have to make it part of our dialogue. And again, I would say, practically speaking, making it the same in breadth as talking about your normal service delivery is a great way to approach these conversations, normalizing them as part of your core expectations. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and I'm just going to kind of piggyback on what Erica said and provide some different perspective on the ground. So as lawyers, we come at it for our client to protect you, and that's where our advice stops. So when you get the legal advice, it stops at the point of contract because you're done. But really what I hear your question asking is the deeper issue, which is the doing the right thing. So I just to kind of piggyback on what Erica said, developing relationships in the host third party place, and understanding the culture of where the participants are receiving your services and or your aid. So there's a multi-pronged approach that you can begin to consider, kind of an anthropological versus a legal perspective, but really developing some key aspects that we look through are making sure that on the ground there's not just one person or two people, or that power is spread across a number of different people. That's a really great strategy to employ, and we dive into that into the guide as well. It depends on internet capacity of where these third parties are located, but there might be a regular check-in that you have with the third party that goes through a standard script every time that you check in. And one of your or two of your questions or a section of your questions is on power, how power is identified, how the recipients can feed back any concerns that they have, and develop that trust with your third party organization so that they can tell you when they're feeling something's not quite right. So hopefully that kind of adds some practical aspect for you.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Shona. Thank you, Jim, for your question. We have another question on Mentimeter. What do you recommend as steps to respond, if any, in the first case study?
I could start out again. I think that's yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. I think we perhaps didn't spend as much time as we intended to on that first case study. So I mean that one is a tricky one, but you know we definitely agree with the majority that it is important to respond. It's you know, how you respond is the challenge, and why we included this as a question. I think that you know, doing a bit of an internal check just to see if you can find out more information about what's being talked about. Like it's possible perhaps this issue has come up and you know, you've talked to your HR colleague and they're like, yeah, I did hear something. Then that's a route to explore, right? If there's any other information you have about that specific situation, dig into it, explore, check in, have bilateral conversations, try to figure out what's being talked about. Failing that, and if you truly can't find any other information, then I think at a minimum, one response is to really do that reflective check-in about the effectiveness of your mitigation plan and its implementation, like Sean and I discussed. Maybe this is a you know, putting us on notice that things aren't as effective, as smooth, communication levels are not as good as we thought they were, and take steps that way to address those proactively. Take it as a signal that maybe not everything is great at a very minimum. But of course, if you can find out more information, then certainly do so. Others, anything else to add on this one?
Yeah, it's information that you can use. Legally, do you legally have to respond? Probably not. It's vague. It's not in a standard complaint process unless your organization allows for or requires anonymous whistleblowers to be addressed in this fashion. Probably not a legal obligation, but it's the right thing to do to maybe check in. Clearly someone's upset, whether it's that requires some follow-up. So that, so just adding that piece to what Erica said.
Thank you. We have another hand raised by Rick.
Thank you. This is follow-up in some ways to the last conversation. What thoughts do you have? This can be legally, or those of you who are not in the legal profession, but on the wisdom of having an external party who receives complaints, especially signed complaints, where people might be worried about retaliation. Do you have counsel that it would be helpful, if possible, to have like an external, a neutral, like an ombuds person kind of person in place to create an even higher likelihood of reporting?
I mean, personally, I think it is, as I was mentioning in earlier, I think it's always good to have more than one option. And having a anonymous complaint mechanism or a within organization ombudsman is one method. I I think it's a good idea, but I think it does have to, it sort of depends on the organization itself. And of course, if you did have either an internal or an external ombudsman or complaint recipient, it would be to further the goal of more complaints. So perhaps if one is a Canadian organization and the majority of one's work is external, of course, the mechanism you have would be something that somebody could actually practically access regardless of their location. And sometimes that's easier with a third party. They have perhaps a access phone line that's available in different countries, or an email. So I think any strategy that works for your organization that encourages multiple lines of escalation of concerns is a really good idea.
Thank you very much. Okay, it's 11:57. We only have 3 minutes left, but don't worry about it. All the questions that are in the chat will be responded at a later date. I just wanted to let you know that we've been planning the next 6 months, and I'm going to paste a document here that you can access to see what are the plans for Digna in the next months. And we are going to share this document with all the participants who are in this session, and also to the Digna's mailing list. So be ready for that. And we would like you to please respond to a very short survey. It's going to be on the chat now. And I would like to thank the lawyers working group for your time. This was a great session, and keep enjoying the forum.
Yeah, I'll just add, we do have, with the Cooperation Forum, our next session is at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's on the policy priorities by and for Cooperation Canada members. So we encourage you all to join, especially if you are Cooperation Canada members. And I will also we'll be sharing the guide. We can do it in the chat right now, but also be sharing it by email, as Noelia said. So I received a lot of questions in the chat on, did we miss something? Did you receive the guide yet? And it is hot off the presses this morning. So this is, you are the first to receive it. And I just want to thank again our Lawyers Working Group for all the hard work that they've put into this guide over the past year. It's been a long process. So thank you all for joining. Please fill out that survey that's in the chat there, and we'll see you at 1 o'clock.